Let me start. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. What I'm going to do is the idea of today's session really is, is to talk through NIST CSF and what it is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about it in the context of cyber regulation and how it is applied within the context of the RMF, because the RMF is a US cyber regulation, and it's very well known and very well understood if you're in federal government, or should be. But we've seen a lot talk about the CSF recently. So let me go into the share. Anybody wants to jump in and ask any questions, as I keep saying, please feel free. So let's start. So first of all, a bit of an introduction to me. You probably gathered by my accent, I'm not American. I am British. I'm based in the UK. I'm based near Cambridge. But I've spent probably the last 25 years within cybersecurity and cybersecurity risk management. I was the global vice president of cyber risk for Banco Santander in Madrid. I built their global second line for cyber risk management. I did it across 23 banks, no, 11 banks and 23 entities. I was a CISO for a Japanese bank. I've worked in engineering, manufacturing, and have quite a broad and deep experience in cyber. In terms of my relationship with the US, I'm one of the founding partners of a cybersecurity business in the US called Veritas GRC. And we specialize in cybersecurity education, specifically focusing on boards and educating boards on cyber regulation, but also on providing advisory. I also own a cyber security company in the UK as well, called Paravar. And again, what we do is we focus on cyber regulation and regulatory compliance. I was a founding member of the US DoD CMMC program, which a lot of you have probably heard of, I hope. I was the only European involved in that program back in 2021, and was part of the team that helped develop the assessment methodology for what was then DFAR 70, 12, 19, and 20, and NIST SP 800 171. So I kind of got a bit of an understanding of cyber. I got a bit of an understanding of cybersecurity and a bit of understanding of cyber risk management. Myself and my teams in the United States, we've written a lot of thought leadership on cybersecurity. We presented to the DoD, we presented to the White House ONCD, we presented to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. I do quite a few presentations with the US Institute of Internal Audit, and I've done the same for the European Institute of Internal Audit as well. And I've got a load of other cybersecurity things going on. I'm chartered security, I'm a chartered engineer, and other stuff. So, we understand cyber, we understand risk management, we understand regulation. Now, what's important about today is when we talk about the CSF, as I say, I'm going to put it in the context of cyber regulation and what makes the CSF different. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to go through every aspect of the CSF and all the controls and everything associated with that, because I'm kind of guessing lots of people on this call probably understand all of that. But I want you guys to understand where the CSF sits and how important I think the CSF now is in cybersecurity regulatory compliance. Certainly in the context of more recently, when what we had, we had the DoD last week talking about the Deputy Undersecretary of the Department of Defense, Ms. Hicks, Honourable Ms. Hicks. She was talking about, the RMF and DoD 851001, and the importance of the RMF on the DoD and the DoD industrial, industry base. And then obviously back in, I think February, March, the DoD announced that, it's developing a DIB cyber strategy. And part of that DIB cyber strategy is integrating or nested under, I think the word is, under, amongst other regulations, the NIST CSF. So, we're feeling as though it's quite important, but let's start to put some of that in context. I'm not really treating today as an education or a training session. Why? Because I'm not an educator and I'm not a trainer. What I'm about is knowledge sharing and knowledge transfer. And as part of this session, we're hoping to transfer some knowledge to everybody and help start the debate. So, if we look at cyber generally, we now know it's probably one of the biggest non-financial risks that we face. It's a risk that, quite clearly, following recent announcements with the FBI and various congressional committee sessions recently, is a national security problem. We've had the head of the FBI making very, very clear that there's a lot of concern around other nation states infiltrating critical national infrastructure. Interestingly, today, I'm just going to switch screens quickly, and I'm going to show you today we've had, this presentation take place, GCHQ, and you had GCHQ, the head of GCHQ. We've had the director of ONCD. We've had other nation states turning up, talking about how critical cybersecurity is now and how critical it is as a national security issue. We've also had, the head of GCHQ talking about another nation state. You saw the first nation state talking about how important cybersecurity is as a national security problem. So we know that cybersecurity is a big issue. We know it has a significant impact. We know it's a geopolitical weapon. We know that nation states are using cyber in lots of different ways to target organizations. There's a great video by Chris Inglis that I often tell people to go and have a look at when he's talking at New York, I think NYU, the law department in 2022, I believe it is, where he's talking about the challenges of cyber and how complicated cyber is to implement and manage. And with all of these things in mind, what we've seen in the last, say, 18 months, 2 years is we've seen, regulators primarily in the US and in the EU start to regulate cybersecurity. So it's a demonstration of the failure, I think, of market forces to manage cyber and the amount of money organizations have been spending on cyber to manage the risk. It's kind of reflected in the fact that, we're now regulating it. And that is a very, very, very serious change, from a cybersecurity perspective. Historically, it's been an unregulated risk where we've relied on organizations to manage it. Well, now we're going to regulate it. And as part of the regulatory process, we're now focusing in some very, very specific areas. We're focusing in on cybersecurity risk management. So with the increase in complexity and severity, of cybersecurity, we've seen the average cost of attacks increase. We've seen the threats increase. We've seen, as I say, US and EU regulators now focusing on regulating the risk. We've also seen an interesting set of challenges within the insurance industry, which really kind of, is making me think about, do insurers have the ability to support their clients manage the risk? And in my view, they don't. We're seeing insurance premiums rise. We're seeing risk, the whole risk transfer conversation start to come into play, where insurers are now recognizing there's a coverage gap, and cyber insurance is not necessarily as effective as it could be, and it's certainly not as profitable as the insurance industry thought it was going to be. So what does that mean? When we said before about regulation, there is some serious regulations coming through that, I'm assuming most of the audience here today is in the US, and you will be very much familiar with the regulation that's sitting on the left-hand side here, the SEC Cyber Rule. And with the SEC Cyber Rule, it's bringing a lot of attention into covered entities on US capital markets and their management of cybersecurity risk. One thing to note, by the way, with these regulations, and we'll just start with the SEC rule, it's all about managing cyber risk. It's not managing cyber security, and there is a difference in my view. What the regulations is doing is saying to organizations, let's just take the SEC, that you must demonstrate that you are able to understand your material cyber risks. And as part of that process, you must be able to demonstrate by managing those material cyber risks, you're going to be able to demonstrate you're mitigating risk and reducing your residual risk. That's not the same as implementing cybersecurity. Implementing cybersecurity has been very much a traditional approach where organizations have come along and implemented a cyber standard, and therefore we're doing cybersecurity. That's not what cyber regulation is now aiming to achieve. When we look EU NIS2 and DORA, these are two big regulations that are coming through in Europe. EU NIS2 and DORA will come into effect. Well, they went onto the EU Journal about 18 months ago in January 2023, and will come into effect in January 2025. And what these two regulations are doing is they're very similar in respect to their expectations. What they expect with NIS2 is that critical national infrastructure providers and the boards of those companies and the companies themselves can demonstrate that, that they are managing cybersecurity risk, that they've got the appropriate governance structures in place, they've got the appropriate risk management framework in place, and they've got the relevant processes in place to demonstrate that risk is being managed. DORA is focusing very similar to NIS2, but it's focusing on financial institutions. And for financial institutions, to demonstrate that those financial institutions have a very clear understanding and can manage ICT risks. And that's not just their internal ICT risks, but it's the ICT risks within their supply chains. So again, what we're seeing here is we're seeing regulators in the EU standing back and going, we've got this cybersecurity problem. We understand it's a significant issue for us and that we're now going to regulate for it. Now, to give you an example of how big NIS2 and DORA are, in our analysis, and we've published a lot of material, by the way, so we published material that's gone into, we published material in Bloomberg, we published material in the Lloyd's Maritime Register. We've written cyber training programs for US attorneys through the American Bar Association and the Federal Bar Association. So when we start, we're quite well published in this area. So we've done a lot of analysis and analytics in this area. When we look at NIS2, we estimate it's going to impact around 75,000 companies across the whole of the 27 EU member states. And DORA is going to impact around 30, potentially 40,000 financial institutions as it's currently, as the regulations currently written. Albeit the Europeans are, Europe, the 27 European states are currently going through a process at the moment to ratify these regulations into their local countries. But it's going to have a significant impact. DoD DFARS, on the other hand, is a rather interesting piece of regulation. Why? Because it's much more, in my view, aligned to traditional cybersecurity, where you have to comply. If you've signed a contract that's got DFARS 252, excuse a spelling mistake there, 252, 204, 7012 in it, you must demonstrate that you're compliant to NIST SP 800 171 and the relevant controls and practices in there. The issue with DFARS for the DoD is for covered defence contractors is that you could potentially lose a contract. The significant changes that SEC rule, NIS2 and DORA bring in is that they potentially have the ability to introduce civil and criminal penalties to organisations that fail to comply. So to give you for those of you I'm hoping probably familiar, or hoping you are familiar, you've got the current case going on between the SEC and SolarWinds, albeit not under the SEC Cyber Rule of 23, but under historical materiality reporting requirements. That is starting to look at, the potential for civil and criminal liabilities to be brought against either the CISO and or the organization for failing to report and obviously manage material risk. So we're seeing a big change within the whole the whole space of with the SEC, of the focus of the SEC on organizations and applying civil and criminal penalties. When we look at EU NIS2 and DORA, they have been very specific. You know, if you read NIS2 and DORA, there are lines in there which allow EU member states to introduce civil or criminal penalties to individuals and or organizations for the failure of complying to cybersecurity risk management. Not cybersecurity, but cybersecurity risk management. And then when we look at NIS2 and DORA, they bring in requirements for boards to have a very clear understanding of cybersecurity risk, the oversight, assurance, and attestation of risk, and the adoption of risk management frameworks, measures, and practices, which then leads us into the conversation ultimately around cybersecurity frameworks and or cybersecurity standards. And we'll talk about that in a little while. So we are seeing a definite change. And if we carry on the way we're carrying on, you know, we're going to see more regulation coming into the US, the United Healthcare cyber incident. I think yesterday or the day before, you know, HHS are now starting to, and I think is it the Ann Neuberger is saying, you know, we want to focus now on cyber regulation for the healthcare industry. Well, you can bet. I would bet anybody $10. I'm not a rich person and I'm not going to bet the house, but I would bet that that is going to be cybersecurity risk management regulation. And if it's cybersecurity risk management regulation, we're going to be heading towards
Hey, Andy.
Yes.
I see that you moved on to the next slide. I had my hands up.
And oh, sorry. Let me go. Yeah, fire away.
Right. I think this is where I wanted to have a question around. So the SEC cyber rule, has it been kind of published, or is it something like we are kind of seeing this is going to be published?
It's enforced. It was, the proposal was put out last year. It was signed in August, came into effect in September, and it was applied from around December the 18th.
All right. So coming to the couple of points which I'm seeing over here.
Yeah.
So it says report material cyber risk and report material cyber incidents in 4 days.
Yes.
How would you differentiate between a cyber risk and a cyber incident? What is the guidelines which has been offered over here?
Okay, so first of all, reporting material cyber risks, that is for an organization to define what is material to that organization. Now, there is, in the regulation, there's some clear guidelines around how regulators expect organizations to identify material cyber risks. Through their 10K reports, they must report those material cyber risks annually to the SEC through their 10K. When it comes to material cyber incident, organizations are required that are on the SEC to report material cyber incidents to the SEC within 4 days once they've determined that incident is material. It is for the organization to define what is material based on some guidelines set by the SEC, and then report that to the SEC. And by definition, you're reporting it to capital markets and you're reporting it to lots of other interested stakeholders.
Yeah, so essentially, I'm trying to understand a little bit more over here. Like when you say a material cyber incident, it does ends up in becoming a risk, right? So it is then becoming a material cyber risk. So how are these two related, or there is no relation?
Well, if it's a material cyber incident, it's a material cyber incident. You know, that's what you have to report. If you had you should have already been able to identify what you believe is material cyber risks anyway through your 10K. You know, you're going to get risks after you've reported the incident, because they're going to create more risks, which under the 8K filing rules, you're going to have to continue to report anyway.
Okay. And how about the reporting risk management process? Like, are we supposed to kind of expose what the risk management process is?
You're meant to disclose what your risk management process is to the SEC, yes.
Okay. All right, we can move ahead.
Okay, so just moving on then. So what does the regulatory transformation do? What the regulatory process does is it shifts risk left of bang. What it means is the traditional process of managing cyber risks has all been very much focused around organizations generally not caring too much about cybersecurity as a problem when an incident happens, relying on cyber insurance. That's kind of generally what most organizations, a lot of organizations have done, typically outside financial services and some other government agencies and other government bodies who generally are pretty good at managing cybersecurity. To a point where if you are mandated and you're a covered entity to manage cybersecurity, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to implement cybersecurity, demonstrate you've implemented cybersecurity, that you've got the oversight, assurance, and attestation of cybersecurity in place. And as you know, to take the question earlier on, you are going to have to report your material cyber risks to, in the case of the SEC through your 10K filings. That's for you to decide as an organization what that materiality, the level of materiality and what those material cyber risks are. But you're going to have to report them. But what that does is it's no longer a right of bang issue, it's now a left of bang issue. Why? Because you've got to demonstrate that you're managing cyber risk to a regulator. And that's a big difference. That is a fundamental difference to what typically has happened previously. Yeah, so you're going to have to prove to somebody that you understand the risk and that you can manage that risk effectively. And there will be somebody now looking at you through a regulatory lens if you're a covered entity, because not everybody's covered. It affects, by the way, we call it efficient allocation of capital. Why? Because you may have decided to use cyber insurance historically as a risk management tool. Well, actually now you're going to have to consider how much money you spend on managing cyber security, or decide whether or not you stay in a market. If you decide not to stay in a market, you'll leave the market. You don't have to comply to the SEC rule. If you don't stay on the market, capital markets, you don't have to comply. But if you do stay on capital markets, expect to be interrogated accordingly, and expect the regulatory process to go through a process. Right then. So pictorially, what does that look like then? What it means is, historically, as we said before, you've sat in the incident, you sat in this process where there's an incident in the middle, we'll go through the reactive process. Well, now you've got to be proactive. If you're in a regulated market, you've got to demonstrate you understand risk. You've got to demonstrate that you've implemented an RMF. You've gone through the whole process, and as part of that process, you're going to have to demonstrate you've got the relevant controls and practices in place to mitigate risk. And potentially, both left and right of bang, you could face civil and criminal conviction. We've seen that potentially work its way through with the SolarWinds case. We've seen it with other cyber cases, over the last couple of years, where individuals have been charged for their failure to manage cybersecurity. And we're going to see more focus on implementing cybersecurity and the costs associated with that and the resources associated with that. On the right of bang, you've got something slightly different. You could still face civil and criminal conviction. If you look at the SEC rule, for example, you're still going to have to report a material cyber incident to the SEC. That's one issue. You could also face, you're still going to have compliance risks. You'll have reputational damage risks, more reputational damage right at bang. And we all know when it comes to cybersecurity, it's more expensive to manage cybersecurity after an incident than it is to fix it before an incident. What does regulatory compliance look like? Well, when you look at the regulations that were above, it's all about demonstrating that you've got oversight, assurance, and you can attest cybersecurity properly as an organization. Now, that is usually done through board governance and board governance processes. But to be able to facilitate those board governance processes, what cyber regulation is doing is changing the dynamic. It's changing the dynamic because in cyber is now, if you're covered, a legal and compliance oversight issue. And as part of that, it becomes a legal problem. It becomes a legal and compliance problem because if you can't demonstrate you're managing cyber risk and a regulator decides that you're not, you could find yourself in a position where you are having a legal compliance conversation with a regulator. That is not the same dynamic as we had in place 2 or 3 years ago. with the SEC rule, EU NIS 2, DORA, not so much the DoD CMMC, because you could lose a contract, albeit you could actually be fined under false claims because if you've attested to cybersecurity risk management compliance, sorry, cybersecurity compliance to NIST SP 800-171, when in fact you didn't. That could, you could face a false claims act case there. And I'm not a lawyer, and I won't go into that. But in respect of being able to demonstrate board governance, you've now got to think about legal and compliance oversight. You've got to think about your organization, whether your organization are trained enough, you've got the right people in the organization that are appropriately skilled, that you've got a risk management framework in place, that you've implemented an RMF, and as part of that RMF, you've actually identified your risks through your risk register, through your RMF process, that you're mitigating those risks through controls, and that you can demonstrate that, and you are collecting the artifacts associated with doing that. Because it's a legal and compliance problem, demonstrating oversight assurance and attestation becomes very, very important, because it could be at some point in time you are asked to demonstrate that you have complied to a regulation. So to give you an example, if we look at the current SolarWinds case, I'm not a legal expert, I don't offer legal advice, but if you look at the approach the SEC took with SolarWinds, they issued Wells notices against SolarWinds, and they were collecting information prior to the 2019 incident and then after the 2019 incident from the SEC's perspective to try and build a case against SolarWinds as to whether or not, they understood material risk. And then they reported appropriate information to the capital markets and the regulator at the time of the incident, post-incident, and pre-incident. So there's a whole dynamic now moving around cybersecurity where it's the responsibility of the organization to demonstrate that it understands risk and is managing risk appropriately, and how. That, again, I keep saying, is what's different, and that's what's changing the dynamic of cybersecurity as far as we see it. So what does that mean, really, in realistic speak? Well, the US have been regulating cybersecurity for a very long time. Now, we can go back to FISMA in 2002, when FISMA was adopted through OMB A130, and then through 2014, and then more recently, where as part of the regulatory process, specifically for federal agencies, organizations, were mandated to federal departments were mandated to implement the RMF. The RMF was delivered through NIST SP 837. It's now 37R2. And within NIST SP 837R2, guess what we have? We have the CSF. The CSF is the Cybersecurity Framework is a framework that's been adopted for quite a number of years in the US as a robust framework for organizations to demonstrate that they have the appropriate controls, the relevant profiles, and the relevant maturity in place to demonstrate they're managing risk. And when you look at 37R2, by the way, and we'll just talk on the SEC complies to 37R2. Or 37 and 37R2, and it goes to an annual audit. So the SEC itself, as a federal agency, demonstrates to Congress that it is implementing the cybersecurity, so the risk management framework and CSF profiles. So why is risk management important for an organization? And then we'll get into why is a CSF important. So why is cybersecurity important? Well, if we look at cybersecurity historically over the last 10 years, typically cybersecurity has probably been treated very much as an extreme loss over near I call number 3 in here. But over the last 3-5 years, it started to move left. It's gone from an extreme event where very few companies actually go through an incident to become much more of a problem. So it's become much more of what we call unexpected, and then into an expected loss. And what do we mean by this? What we mean by this is, extreme events happen, hurricane, or not hurricane's a bad example in the US, in the Midwest. Hurricanes in the UK are an extreme loss event. They don't happen. Earthquakes don't happen in the UK. But they do happen in other parts of the world more frequently. So we don't tend to plan for those in the UK. But when we talk about, events that are unexpected, but we know they're going to happen, that's much more of a case, say, with, in some parts of the US and not others, where, you're not likely to get many hurricanes, or certainly not get many earthquakes. Unexpected event would be an earthquake maybe in San Francisco. It's going to happen. You can try and plan for it. You could move out the area and do something about it. Cyber is moving into this unexpected and then expected space, where it's actually, quite likely to happen. The probability of a cyber incident several years ago was probably, heading down towards zero, or down towards zero, a little bit above zero. It's now moving up the line, heading towards 1. So the probability of cyber incident is more likely than not. It is becoming more likely, not it is more likely, it's becoming, more, the potential of a cyber attack is more likely. So really, organizations are now starting to have to think about how they're going to manage this, and how they're going to start to understand and manage the risk. And as we see with the curve, what the whole idea of managing cybersecurity risk is, it's all about an organization understanding what its expected losses are, the things it knows that are going to go wrong, and budgeting for those, understanding the unexpected losses, and then looking at capital, its own money, and cyber insurance to manage those. And in extreme loss cases, there's not a lot you can do about it. But when you then look at the risk from a cybersecurity risk management perspective, what you want to do is you want to better manage that risk. You want to demonstrate you can manage the risk, and you want to reduce that risk down to an acceptable level. That is what we're trying to do with cybersecurity risk management. What we want to do is we want to bring the risk down, the impact of the risk down as much as we possibly can. And that is, again, where the CSF profile actually comes in. And as part of that risk management process, we need to be able to go through a life cycle of, understanding the risk, mitigating the risk, reporting the risk, and doing that within the context of a governance framework. So we'll have a governance framework which, regulations are now asking us to implement, so that boards can demonstrate they understand risk. We need to go through a risk management process following an RMF, in the case of NIST SP 800 37R2. And then as part of that risk management process, going through a risk mitigation exercise so that we can implement controls to mitigate the risk. So we're bringing that risk down. And then to cap all that, we want to then report that appropriately. And we want to continually go around this loop, as it were, so that we're continually feeding the board and with leadership with our understanding of risk. The risk assessment process is continual. Risk mitigation is something that's happening, proactively, and then we're reporting. So what we want to do is we want to ensure that this process continues to happen, and the cybersecurity framework actually helps us do that to some degree. If we look at the RMF, and you have to excuse the top there, that should be risk management framework and cybersecurity. When we look at the RMF and we look at 37R2, we can actually see that controls, effectively what is embedded into the NIST CSF, form a big part of the RMF life cycle. So when we look at what the risk management process is for any organization, an organization has to demonstrate that it can select its controls, that it can demonstrate that it's implemented those controls, and assesses those controls. There is appropriate authorization processes in place so that an organization where it's implemented controls, those controls have been authorized, and then they're monitored. So controls themselves, which is part of the RMF, become quite a critical component of the CSF. And as the organization goes through its risk management life cycle, it goes through the RMF, it's continually developing its controls framework, and it's continually identifying the controls that it needs to put in place. When we look at the first building blocks of the RMF. It's actually the prepare step. When we look at the prepare step, if any organization wants to start implementing cybersecurity risk management, we tend to start with the prepare step, because the prepare step is about building the foundations of the organization. It's about ensuring that we've got the relevant leadership and the risk management strategy and the risk assessment processes in place. It's also about ensuring that we've identified the controls and identified a controls framework. Now, again, CSF is that controls framework. It's also, once we get into the controls framework, when we look at the prepare step, it's about identifying common controls and implementing a continuous monitoring strategy around controls. So I'm hoping you see, when we go through this process, when you look at the RMF and the need to implement risk management, you're seeing the importance of the CSF, because it's very integral to the risk management process. But it's also about identifying the right controls within the CSF for the organization, which is also important and critical as part of the risk management framework. So what is the CSF? Finally, I hear you all ask after 35 minutes. So the CSF, a lot of people, when they look at the CSF, they tend to go, it's a great suite of controls. It's a great suite of outcomes, the word is used in the CSF, of things that you should do to mitigate cybersecurity risks. It's actually more than that. When you look at the CSF, it's several things. And it's one reason, in our view, why federal government likes the CSF, because there's a lot of flexibility within the CSF. And there's one question here about the presentation. Yes, this material will be made available. The CSF is, as I say, it has a core called the CSF core. It's a hierarchy of functions, categories, and subcategories, and a list of outcomes, what we would traditionally call controls. But it's also a suite of profiles. So what you can do with the CSF, which typically cybersecurity standards like ISO 27001 or NIST SP 800 171 or 53 R5, I think is the latest SP 800 53 R5 standard. They're standards. They're very predefined lists of activities. What you can do with the CSF is you can actually create different control groups or different control families based on what is on the right-hand side there, those functions, those identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, and now govern, targeting specific either data classes, organizations, even potentially systems. So you could have systems that are more, need a higher, a more higher risk system, where you want to implement certain specific controls or more controls than you would on another system. What you can do is create a CSF profile specifically for that system. Now, what you would argue is, well, you can do that with 27001, and you can put 27001 as the suite of controls into the CSF. What the CSF also does is it has tiering. So with the tiering, you can implement a number of tiers. And if anybody wants to research the SEC's annual report for cybersecurity risk management compliance under the RMF, you will see that the auditor assesses the cybersecurity maturity of the SEC against a number of tiers. So let's look at the framework itself. So what makes CSF2 different to what was the predecessor, which is 1.1, is apart from in changing slightly some of the controls within identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, it's introduced a special category or a new category called governance. Now, some of you may have caught on as well that a lot of the cyber regulation is now focused on governance and boards demonstrating governance and regulatory compliance, and boards being able to demonstrate they've got the relevant processes in place in the boardroom to oversight, assure, and attest cybersecurity. So it's our view that it makes sense for the CSF to have a governance function in it. And when we look at what's in that governance function, it aligns quite nicely to what some of the regulators and regulators are now talking about when it comes to cybersecurity risk management. You've now got category IDs for risk management strategy, roles, responsibilities, and authorities, policies for risk management oversight and assurance, and supply chain risk. These are all new. And in our view, these are being put in there to help strengthen the CSF, because traditionally the CSF has been about identification of assets and risks and improvements, protecting. IDAM typically is another good one, which is protect, data security, technology infrastructure resilience, then monitoring through detect, and then incident response and incident recovery. What you've now got is the governance layer over and above all that, which is about kind of like putting a wrap around some of what's happening within the organization. So the identify, protect, detect, respond, recover functions are being used to help support an organization manage risk, but also feeding that up through to the board through a risk management strategy and making sure the board's got the relevant roles and responsibilities, identify the relevant policies, and providing the appropriate oversight. So the framework itself, is much more, in our view, aligned to where cyber regulators are moving to, given the SEC final rule, EU NIS2 and DORA. NIST is not particularly bothered about NIS2 and DORA, but when it comes to being able to demonstrate that for an organization is complying to regulations like NIS2 and DORA, the CSF2 controls categories, or the core fits, in our view, very nicely to what regulators are looking to do both in the US and the EU. And underneath those categories, by the way, you will find a suite of they call it outcomes. I'll call them controls or activities that would be expected to be implemented. And that's what I think makes CSF quite powerful. The framework, the profiles piece is rather interesting. And in this deck, by the way, at the bottom of the deck, and I'm not going to go through it in a lot of detail, but I'll show you it, is a number of CSF profiles that are recognized by CISA across a number of industry sectors. So what CISA have done is they've taken the concept of CSF and they've written specific CSF profiles against industry sectors. So there's one for energy, there's ones for nuclear, there's one for water, I think there's oil and gas is in there, there's certainly one for marine, but there's a number of sector-specific profiles. Why? Because different sectors have different risk profiles. So it makes sense that, where you have a very asset-intense industry sector, and I mean asset in terms of, let's say oil and gas is very asset intensive, you may want to put specific more controls around asset management that you would potentially in a less asset intensive industry. It's a very bad analogy, but I think you probably get you get the drift.
So
go on. Sorry, yes, go for it.
So this profiles which you're talking about, is this a new addition to CSF 2.0? And if it is so, how were the profiles really thought about? Like, how were they structured?
They're not. They've been around for a long time. Let me just jump ahead. I'm going to answer the question. So I'm just going to go down to the deck. So here you go. So these are typical CSF profiles developed by CISA and DHS. So there's one for the chemical industry, Homeland Security, so on and so on and so on. We've written a lot about them. There's a manufacturing CSF profile that was specifically written for critical manufacturing. They've been around. You'd have to look at specific dates, but they've been around the last 5 years. They've been there. This is the interesting dynamic, by the way, when people talk about CSF. When people talk about CSF, often the feeling is it's a set of controls. It's more than that. It's a framework of controls. Here, what is core to the CSF, and underneath on the right-hand side here, when we've got these categories, under those categories, there's a set of outcomes, controls. But what the CSF does is, you can have organizational profiles. You could write a profile if you are a multinational and you've got different different business units, and you know some parts of the world are potentially more susceptible to cyber. That's obviously changing now. You may decide to have a profile for a specific business unit, and you may want to make that more intensive than other business units. But they were there under 1.1, and that's what makes them interesting. The other thing with the CSF is the maturity. When you come to assess your controls you've implemented within the organization back up to the core again, what you can do is you can identify the maturity you've either partially implemented. Those controls are risk informed. Those controls are risk informed and repeatable. Those controls are risk informed, repeatable, and adaptive. By that I mean that you've got you can with the CSF. You can do it anyway, but the CSF just brings it into a nice package. Enables you to create a view of the organization around the maturity of its cybersecurity and management of cybersecurity risk. And I think that's what again makes the CSF very, very, very powerful. And when you look at the CSF and you read through it and you go through it in detail, it's as I say, it's more than just a suite of controls. And again, that's what's important. Where does CSF come into play? Let's talk regulatory compliance. If we look at regulatory compliance, well, first of all, let's take governance. Now, if you have got to prove to a regulator that you are managing cybersecurity risk, and you have got oversight, assurance, and you're attesting to that risk, you are going to have to demonstrate that you have a controls framework. You are going to have to demonstrate that you understand what your controls are, those control practices. You're going to have to demonstrate that you are reporting to the regulator that you have a process in place for cybersecurity risk management, and that as part of that process for cybersecurity risk management, that you have identified controls and those controls are effective, because you can't demonstrate you are managing cybersecurity risk without demonstrating that you have effective controls, because demonstrating you're managing risk by its own definition means that you've got to demonstrate that you understand your inherent risk and your residual risk. And that residual risk is within a tolerance that you feel is acceptable and is or is not material to the organization. You've also got to demonstrate as part of that, when you're going through that risk management process, that you have mitigated risk. Yeah, so CSF, again, it's all part of that risk mitigation process, because I've identified my threats, I've identified my vulnerabilities, I've implemented an RMF, I've implemented a suite of controls. I know what my inherent risk is, I know what my controls are doing, and I can have some form of assessment on what my residual risk is, and I'm going to report that to the board. Because the board at some point in time may be challenged by a regulator, if it is in a regulated industry, to actually demonstrate it's done that. And that is a process that you've really got to follow. Now, with that in mind, I think part of the challenge here for some is going to be, I think let's take a back step from that. I think for some, the SEC challenge against SolarWinds is going to define a direction of travel for some regulated entities, and the SolarWinds case, I think, goes to oral hearing this week with the SEC and SolarWinds. If that progresses to a trial, that's going to demonstrate to the markets that this cybersecurity risk management thing is quite serious, and may force organizations to consider moving ahead and implementing the whole cybersecurity risk management as we see in terms of the RMF and the controls. And the same with EU-NIS2 and DORA next year, because organizations that will have to focus on implementation of cybersecurity risk management through DORA and NIS2 will also have to demonstrate that they've got governance, risk assessment, can mitigate risks, and a reporting risk. So CSF forms a big part of all of this. Either the CSF through its controls, through its profiles, and then through its maturity. It would be a good idea if you can demonstrate maturity, for example, to a regulator, because it demonstrates where you are today and where you want to go. So again, I think that is, you know, a part of the power of the CSF. CSF as well, you know, where can it sit within an organization? You know, you can use it as a baseline standard. You know, use it to set a minimum set of cybersecurity practices or controls. You can then use it to demonstrate, you know, maturity. You can use it to demonstrate, you know, for example, in some business units, you may have a higher risk. Well, the CSF, you could use that to demonstrate, you know, in certain business units where you want to apply more rigor over certain controls and practices and have a specific profile for that particular industry, so that particular division within your business units. And I think that again is what is nice about the CSF. One of the areas we're going to talk about as part of this as well is the DoD. And I just want to touch on that quickly. The DoD has been required to comply to the RMF for a number of years. I don't know how long, but maybe going back to 2002. But then I think more recently introduced something called DoD 851001, which is its implementation of the RMF. Now, last week we had the Kathleen Hicks, I think, Kathleen Hickson, the Deputy Undersecretary of the DoD. She released a memo on the right that basically made it very, very clear that the DoD takes the RMF very, very seriously. And, you know, it expects that the DoD is testing, reusing and reciprocating the risk management framework across all its departments, the Army, all its components, the Army, Navy and Air Force, so that it's not duplicating risk management. Well, by definition that it's taking the RMF seriously in 851001, part of the RMF is the implementation of the CSF. And interestingly, the DoD announced back in March that it's implementing a DoD DIB cybersecurity strategy to strengthen cybersecurity across its defense industry base. And as part of that, what it's done is and these are its words, it's nested the DoD DIB strategy under many things, one of which is called the NIST CSF. So again, the DoD DIB strategy is now starting to point towards the NIST CSF as an active requirement, which makes sense given the fact that it has to comply, or it's implemented its own version of the RMF under DoD 851001. And you can go and read all of these. There's references in this document for people to read. Also, interestingly, and it's just for everybody to have a think about later on, is if we look at how the RMF has come together with the DoD and the DoD, it's all driven, as we said earlier on, from the circular OMB A130. So all of these regulations are actually kind of tied together through regulations or acts into FISMA, and then FISMA into the DoD, by example. But also, if you think about it, other federal agencies are also required to comply to FISMA. Could it be that other federal agencies, through their compliance to FISMA and 837, like the SEC? Oh, sorry, no, the SEC does comply to 837. Oh, and the SEC goes through an annual audit of 837, and it goes through an annual maturity assessment of 837 against its CSF. So, you know, again, hopefully you can see the CSF and the RMF and FISMA and US cyber regulation are all intertwined, which is important. And when we look at the DIB strategy from earlier on this year, we can see how important it is, because it kind of all integrates together. You know, if we've got CSF being mentioned in the DIB strategy to strengthen collaboration and cybersecurity compliance, then, you know, you can see where the CSF probably sits in here as a tool to help support that. I won't go through this because I've probably talked on this a lot, and I'm also conscious of the time and any questions that come out of this. And again, I'll correct the picture, so sorry for the text on the right-hand side here. So if we talk CSF, as I've said a minute ago, you know, it is becoming a primary, well, it is a primary framework that the DoD is recommending for the public and private sector through its DIB strategy. And one does wonder, and there's another DoD in there that integrates risk management into DoD procurement, what the future holds for the DoD, the CSF, and defence procurement. Because the US has written a lot of this regulation already, whether it's FISMA and the CSF, how it will move forward with implementing, the DoD will move forward with implementing FISMA and CSF. So in summary, and I'm conscious it's only an hour and there's a lot to cover in this, and it's probably going to be a slightly different paradigm view than most of you may have been expecting. From our point of view, the CSF is quite powerful. It's not just a suite of controls. It's a suite of control functions, categories, subcategories that allows you to embed risk management through the RMF and the CSF and the controls together, so that once you start to get a better view of your risks, you can tailor control. You can create CSF profiles specifically to risks, maybe data classes. You may have a different CSF profile for PAI than you do for critical data. Or more secure data, controlled or classified information being an example. Or you may have, you may be in the medical industry, where you've got PII on one side, but you've got intellectual property on the other, and you may want to have a specific CSF profile tailored towards the protection of medical intellectual property. That's what you can do with the CSF profile. You could do it with, you could do it with controls, but it just provides a much more structured approach to doing that, which I think is very, very useful. As I said before, there is the NIST Resource Centre, and again, through this paper, there's lots of CSF profiles that have already been written that you can find through the NIST website, chemical sector, commercial facilities. Some of these actually are more new. We've seen one, I think, recently for the election, control of election systems. And manufacturing profile. We've done videos on the CSF 1.1 manufacturing profile before. You've got CSF profiles for energy, emergency services. So they're not new. Back to the question earlier on. These aren't new. These are out there. But also, we've got there is very much an argument that 800/171 from the resource center in NIST is a CSF profile, because it's specifically targeted one data class under CUI. And healthcare sector, nuclear, and so on. So there's a lot in here for people to unpack and look at and kind of start to digest. Now, today, I'm doing this 1 hour session as an education. What we are planning to do is we're going to look at writing a CSF2 training program, a 3-day training program, where my colleague Ted Jekanowski, who is a very well-known educator in cyber, will start to unpack the CSF. We'll start to unpack the RMF and the CSF in a lot of detail, and start to look at the application of CSF and the implementation of CSF. And what we will do is we will start to go through and start to look at, for example, the framework from the top in terms of the core through profiles, and then tiering and maturity, and how that aligns to risk management. How do you implement the risk management framework, and then how do you align your cybersecurity and create and align your cybersecurity frameworks with the RMF, all focusing around regulatory compliance. And that is it. And I'm just short of the top of the hour. I'm going to stop sharing now and then come into questions. Questions, anybody?
Andy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
If you open up the chat, there's been some questions posted throughout the event.
Okay.
I have chatted them back, but if there's anything you want to dig into, that might be a good starting point.
Okay. So let's have a look. So will the presentation be shared? Yes, it's going to be shared. Will G be required as they are not in the EU now? John, I think that question is probably related to EU NIS2, DORA, and the SEC. Yes, they do comply. They comply by the nature of if you trade in those jurisdictions. So if you're a UK firm on a US capital market, you are going to have to comply to the SEC rule. It does include foreign private issuers. If you are trading in the EU with critical national infrastructure, or you're a financial services firm in the EU, then yes, you will have to comply to DORA. It also comes back the other way. So, if you are an ICT vendor in the UK providing services into Europe, you'll be required to buy. We'll take a financial institution in Europe that takes a service from the UK. I know a cloud service, or you're a software vendor. You will have to demonstrate cybersecurity risk management, because they are going to have to demonstrate it, and they have to evaluate ICT risk. That's one. There's another regulation we've not talked about today, which is the Cyber Resilience Act. And that's where organizations that sell internet-enabled products and services in the EU will be required to have a cybersecurity certificate of compliance. If you haven't got one, then you won't be able to sell or distribute. You won't be able to sell your products into the EU, and distributors will not be able to distribute your products into the EU. So there's that. What else have we got? So ISO 27001 is pretty weak. You can prove, you can generate appropriate documentation, which is different. So the thing with, so this is John Dowling, your question here is, the thing with regulation now is cybersecurity risk management regulation. So it's going to be for organizations to, first of all, demonstrate they understand the risk, which is going to be your RMF, but also demonstrate you're mitigating those risks through your controls framework, and embedded that through, say, into the CSF. So you're going to have to demonstrate that you're managing the risk, and you're going to have to collect the information to do that, and you're going to have to demonstrate it on a regular basis. Annually, with, say, for example, with the SEC rule, you have to provide a 10K to the SEC annually, and you have to provide an 8K whenever there's a material cyber incident. At the moment, it's not as clear yet what that's going to mean for EU NIS2 and DORA, because it's still being transposed by the 27 member states. So Germany may have a slightly different interpretation of NIS2 and DORA than, say, the French. Well, that will come out over sort of the next 4 months or so. The deadline for transposing the rule is October this year, and then starting to comply in January. Some countries have actually pushed that out a bit. So that, and where are we? And that's it. Any other questions, any feedback, any thoughts, any observations from anybody? So John, thanks. Previously, if you showed due diligence and were breached, fines would be not as high. Yeah, that's a good point. I think, it's not, I think regulators are looking for you to demonstrate reasonableness, reasonable and adequate compliance. If you look at some of the papers that we've written and presented, we wrote a paper on the SEC rule about reasonable, adequate, and material. You've got to be able to demonstrate, that you're doing something. You are not going to be able to manage all risk. It is not possible. And as part of that process, you want to demonstrate that you are adhering as much as adhering to the the intent and the principles of the regulation. If you've got an RMF, you can't manage your risks, but you've got an RMF. Good. If you've got your controls in place and you're mitigating, you can demonstrate you are doing your best economically to mitigate risk, you're in a defendable position. What we believe is going to happen, and we work with attorneys in the US, we work with auditors in the US. What we believe will start to happen is you're going to start to see regulators adopt as they go through compliance, an approach which becomes much more legalistic. And I think it's all about being able to demonstrate to general counsel and the regulator and ultimately lawyers that you've done your best. You're not perfect, but you've done your best. And that's what's important here. It's being able to demonstrate that you've done your best. And by adopting the CSF, by adopting the RMF, by ensuring you've got good governance in place, or you've got governance in place, you are going some way to demonstrate that is the case. And that's what's important. And I think with that in mind, if anybody wants to ask another question, if anybody wants to reach out, by the way, myself and Brian are out there on LinkedIn. We'll be sending the presentation to training camp, and they can then pass that out. As I say, kind of anybody wants anybody wants to know any more, anybody wants a conversation, please reach out. With that in mind, I will close the session down. And thank you for everybody for attending. Take care, everyone.